Well, this epic phenomenon became the blueprint for the assassination of JFK Coverup. As 2025 became 2026, two of the U.S. government's darkest secrets appeared to be on the verge of long-awaited full disclosure in Washington, D.C. After decades of denial and suppression, at sporadic congressional committee hearings from 2022 to 2025, the U.S. military admitted that its Navy radar captured a flying object on 3 occasions that could not be identified as belonging to any nation on Earth, such as this radar image taken from the USS Nimitz. And in 2025, the Trump Task Force on the Declassification of Federal Secrets held several congressional hearings with a declared open mind about multiple gunmen and a commitment to full disclosure and release of the remaining classified JFK assassination files. The House Committee on Oversight and Accountability Task Force, led by Republican Representative Anna Paulina Luna, has heard evidence of a possible JFK conspiracy involving more than one gunman. How times have changed as it relates to the government's handling of the two greatest enduring mysteries of the 21st century. As fascinating and hopeful these two congressional investigations are in 2026, even more intriguing is how the cover-ups of the unidentified aerial phenomenon UAP and JFK assassination appear to be linked to each other. Let's start with the controversial UFO phenomenon that goes back to what followed this initial newspaper report of a crash flying saucer in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. The headline reads, RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. Only a day after the crash, the U.S. military nixed the flying saucer narrative and announced that the crash debris in the farmer's field was a high-altitude weather balloon, as stated in this headline in the Roswell Daily Record one day later. Since then, thousands of UFOs have been witnessed around the world, now referred to as unidentified aerial phenomenon, or UAPs. This is one of the most incredible pictures captured of a UAP in the country of Colombia. Until that 2025 hearing in Washington, D.C., the U.S. government had tried to explain away every UFO sighting as anything but possible visitors from beyond planet Earth, such as this photograph of the Phoenix Lights, which was printed in the Phoenix New Times. Just 16 years after the crash Roswell flying saucer incident, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas by what the U.S. government claimed to be a lone nut assassin. It would be no coincidence that both historic events would be subject to decades of doubt, controversies, and conspiracy theories. They are intriguingly linked. Here's how. For what can only be perceived matters of national security, once the military declared the crashed Roswell craft to be a high-altitude weather balloon rather than a flying saucer not of this Earth, secrecy became the top priority. But would a downed weather balloon in 1947 have triggered what President Harry Truman did next? With deceased alien beings reportedly in captivity at Roswell, along with highly advanced ET technology, Truman created a secret commission on September 24, 1947, called Majestic 12, or MJ-12. Headed by America's first Secretary of Defense, James V. Forrestal, Majestic 12 was formed to develop a strategic plan to 1. Assemble a team of top aeronautic experts to reverse engineer the advanced technologies from alien craft that come into the possession of the U.S. government. 2. Develop an operations manual on how to effectively take control of an ET crash site. This manual became known as SOM 1-01, Extraterrestrial Entities and Technology, Recovery and Disposal. 3. Keep the UFO phenomenon secret from the public, from distancing civilians from a crash site to a blanket denial of an alien vessel being involved in the incident. And 4. Create a list of viable alternatives for a crash site or UFO sightings, other than an alien craft, such as a weather balloon, nuclear weapon mishap, or a classified military aircraft, as well as causes for optical illusions, from satellites to planets, stars, or naturally occurring phenomena, such as gaseous materials or meteors. It was the UFO threat to national security, as well as an emerging Cold War with the Soviets, rather than a downed weather balloon, that also prompted Truman to create the National Securities Act of 1947, a National Security Council, and the Central Intelligence Agency. The great fear at that time was that the Soviets may have superior military technology. As Dwight Eisenhower was about to occupy the Oval Office, the Washington UFO flap occurred, involving multiple mysterious flying objects sighted over the nation's capital. And this was captured in this headline by the New York Times in 1952. So the lead headline says, "Flying objects near Washington spotted by both pilots and radar." The key thing here is that it wasn't just flying objects or lights seen by people on the ground who had never seen anything like it before. Not this time. This was also reported by both experienced pilots and their radar systems. And the second headline is also intriguing. Air Force reveals reports of something, perhaps saucers, traveling slowly, but jumping up and down. And the inference here is that the objects that were seen in the skies didn't act normally like a flying plane would do. They were jumping up and down, which was very bizarre at the time. For his 8 years as President of the United States, Eisenhower kept Truman's new security structures in place, including Majestic 12, assembled specifically to suppress the potential national security threat of the trending UFO phenomenon. And then came youthful President John F. Kennedy, welcomed by this public exit warning by Eisenhower. Beware the unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. Right from the outset, JFK clashed with his top general, Curtis LeMay. For instance, Kennedy didn't like MJ-12's modus operandi of secrecy and suppression, suspecting he too was being kept out of the loop on its activities despite it involving matters of national security. Since MJ-12 was an active clandestine arm of the U.S. military operating in block ops type secrecy, its activities were always classified. But JFK also clashed with his military brass over major issues such as the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and Vietnam. Kennedy had a growing mistrust of both his CIA and military leadership over their hawkish approach toward dealing with Khrushchev and the Soviets. He forced CIA Director Allen Dulles to resign after the failed Bay of Pigs. The CIA and military hierarchy felt JFK was too soft on communism. A CIA military alliance to assassinate President Kennedy is one of the more popular unproven conspiracy theories. That became inevitable when LBJ named fired CIA Director Allen Dulles as one of the 7 Warren Commission members. The UFO phenomenon was an early Cold War issue where JFK clashed more internally than with his Soviet foe. U.S. intel suggested that UFO sightings had also increased in the Soviet Union, as unmanned craft Venera 1 was launched to explore the atmosphere of Venus in 1961, when the Soviets led the space race. Venera 1 exploded while still in Earth's atmosphere. With the space race in its infancy, Kennedy saw the Venera 1 incident as a war-provoking catastrophe waiting to happen. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev could claim the U.S. shot it down as an act of war and retaliate. This was hardly far-fetched at the time, since U-2 spy plane pilot Francis Gary Powers was shot down in Soviet airspace on May 1, 1960, after several successful Soviet reconnaissance missions. The incident stunned Eisenhower since it was believed the spy plane's 70,000-foot altitude was beyond the radar tracking and reach of Soviet missiles. JFK worried that UFO sightings in the Soviet Union could be mistaken for further U.S. aggression that could trigger a counteract of war by the Kremlin. Even worse, Americans viewed Khrushchev to be unstable, with a finger on the nuclear launch button. This prompted two stunning directives by President Kennedy to signal a thawing of the Cold War, both contrary to the hawkish thinking of his own military and CIA higher-ups. Per this National Securities Action Memorandum 271, just 10 days before he was assassinated, JFK directed NASA to cooperate on mutual outer space programs with its Soviet counterparts. Since spying in sovereign airspace was considered an act of war, JFK reasoned that if the US and Soviets shared information about knowns and unknowns in each other's skies, it could avert an accidental, deadly conflict. Kennedy's second directive was an apparent attempt to bypass Majestic 12 and its suppressive UFO methodologies. He tasked NASA to take charge of studying cases of unknowns in the skies. After personally delivering his directives to NASA in Cape Canaveral on November 16, JFK would make his fateful trip to Dallas 6 days later. His directives would never be carried out. Instead, President Lyndon Johnson would continue MJ-12's blueprint for government suppression and cover-up of UFOs, as well as events it wanted kept from the public under the guise of national security. If this clandestine agency could keep people in the dark about what they were seeing with their own eyes, why not the murder of a president who had enemies within? Was the creation of MJ-12 in 1947 the start of a deep state within the military CIA complex? When accused JFK lone assassin Lee Oswald was himself murdered before a public trial began, this enabled LBJ to implement the MJ-12 blueprint for secrecy and suppression. How? Instead of a public trial at which a jury would consider both exculpatory and incriminating evidence subject to cross-examination, LBJ created the Warren Commission to hold private hearings at which Oswald was not permitted legal representation. It was all one-sided. An example of deliberate suppression of evidence of potentially more than one gunman was that the U.S. government, via its Warren Report and Zapruder film rights owner Life magazine, both declined to publish images of JFK's physical reaction to the fatal headshot, which strongly suggests a gunman at front of the limousine. In addition to the suppression of film and photo evidence of JFK's physical reaction to the lethal headshot, which you can see here in frame 323 of the Zapruder film, the red lines indicate that the president, upon receiving the fatal headshot, was driven back against his car seat, while the position of Mrs. Kennedy has not changed. The MJ-12 playbook guided the JFK assassination cover-up in the following ways. LBJ put J. Edgar Hoover's FBI in charge of the JFK investigation and the evidence it would make available to the Warren Commission. Hours after Oswald was killed, Hoover wrote an internal memo expressing the importance of convincing the public that he was the lone or sole assassin. Think long term. Despite the commission's conclusion that President Kennedy was murdered by lone nut assassin Lee Harvey Oswald, President Johnson imposed a 75-year ban on hundreds of thousands of documents normally done to protect matters of national security. Control the evidence. As a glaring example, the U.S. military took possession of JFK's body, resulting in unqualified pathologists conducting the autopsy, which became a calamity of errors, omissions, obvious lack of competence, and even deliberate wound misrepresentations to posture a lone gunman. As detailed in the military JFK autopsy video on this platform, a civilian medical examiner had to be denied access to JFK's body, so the government could nefariously orchestrate, manipulate, and purposely alter autopsy findings toward a predetermined result, to frame Lee Oswald as the lone nut assassin. Control witnesses. Of the more than 60 witnesses in Dealey Plaza who felt they saw or heard a gunshot come from the grassy knoll at JFK's right front, only a select few were interviewed by the Warren Commission, and all of them were dismissed as mistaken. Instead, the dozens of eyewitnesses and ear witnesses who thought that all the shots came from the book depository building above and behind JFK, where Oswald worked, were cited in the Warren report as evidence that JFK was assassinated by one gunman. Suppress conflicting evidence. The Warren Commission manipulated the witnesses and evidence it considered. It ignored or suppressed almost all exculpatory evidence, including its very own test results, such as the ballistic tests at Wright, that disproved its own single bullet theory. A public trial would have subjected all witnesses, evidence, and the autopsy findings to cross-examination, as well as permitted exculpatory evidence to be presented to a jury. Until the Zapruder film was shown on national TV 12 years later by Geraldo Rivera, public opinion was shaped exclusively by evidence to fit the narrative that Oswald was the lone assassin. When the American people finally got to see the film on 1975, How President Kennedy Died, they were stunned to realize that it was not as presented in the Warren Report in 1964. In 2026, upwards of 65% of Americans believe at least two gunmen assassinated JFK. Another necessary part of a cover-up is a compliant mainstream media, which in this instance was willing to accept the findings of the Warren Report as fact. They treated exculpatory evidence by independent researchers or reporters as one of the earliest forms of fake news. The result? The goal was achieved. Oswald was the lone nut assassin, went virtually uncontested in the court of public opinion for the first 12 years, which was to continue to 2038 until these three things happened. Before Geraldo televised the full Zapruder film, the Freedom of Information Act became law in 1966, enabling anyone to seek the release of withheld classified documents. Many released documents discredit the findings of the Warren Report. Just 9 years after JFK was murdered, the Nixon-Watergate scandal proved to Americans that their government at its highest level could act criminally, then lie about it and even attempt to cover it up. In 1978, the House Select Committee on Assassinations released its report. It concluded that President Kennedy likely died as a result of a conspiracy, but could not name the conspirators involved. Two of history's greatest mysteries and their cover-up may finally be on the verge of full disclosure. Ending the cover-up that links these two great mysteries will finally reveal that we are not alone, and neither was Lee Oswald.